Welcome to session 5 of Nuts and Bolts and New Ventures. We've spent the last 4 sessions talking about the kind of things you need to think about it with a new venture. Everything from questions you have to answer to who's your customer, what's your model for capturing value, the business model. We've talked about people and organizational issues. We've talked to founders about their journeys and the things they would do differently or pitfalls to look out for. We've had some discussion of legal issues. Bob last night talked about how to present your venture. And so assuming you've done all that homework, which is never linear, it's never that you say, oh, I got a customer and then I got a model. It usually cycles back as you try to really pin it down. At some point, you may, it's not required, but you may find that you need to bring in financial resources. And that's what the panel is tonight. In fact, all of tonight is financial. We start with a panel on financing sources, and then in the second part, financial projections. But as to sources, all financing sources are not equal. Some fit very well with certain types of ventures. Some would be a total non-starter. And so to explore that whole world of where does money come from and how does it get invested and all of that, we have Julianne Zimmerman, who has done this panel for a number of years. Julianne has, like all of our speakers, is highly paid and has a vast experience, all of which is in the bio on the website. So it would take too long to talk about all the wonderful things. But so I'll turn it over to you, Julianne, and you can introduce the panel or take it from here. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. I really miss doing this in 10-250, where we can have a much more interactive session. I promise to pay attention to the chat as we're going along. So if you have comments or questions, please put them there, and we will fold them in. We'll also make time for specifically dedicated Q&A. So as Joe said, I've led this conversation for the past several years for the Nuts and Bolts course. I do that from the perspective of, first of all, an alumna. I was course 16 and 21, which is not a combination you hear often. And I have since worked as an engineer. I've been a co-founder. I've been an advisor, board member, consultant, early team member, you name it, to a wide range of companies. I became a seed stage investor, and I'm now managing director and a member of the general partner with Reventure Capital here in Boston. I also teach innovative social enterprises at Tufts, and I'm a mentor with MIT Venture Mentoring Service and other entities. And I also am a grant reviewer for several bodies here in the States and outside the US. The panel you have in front of you this evening is far more impressive than I am, so I am not going to dominate the conversation. What I really want to do is just give you a little bit of grounding and then have the panelists introduce themselves. You have in the Nuts and Bolts course materials quite a few really informative links Joe has already assembled for you. I hope that you have already gone through at least some of those to give you a little bit of framework for tonight's conversation, because we're going to dive right in. But again, if you have questions, if there are things that we're talking about that aren't familiar to you or that you want us to elaborate, please put that in the chat. Normally, if we were gathered in person, I would ask you by show of hands to let us as a panel know how many of you are already founders, how many of you are aspiring founders, how many of you are already seeking funding of some kind or another or thinking about it, or how many of you are working in startups. And so you're here to learn more about the startup world. I would also ask you questions about what sectors you're in, whether you're in, software and digital or hardware, whether you're in any number of sectors. We see a lot coming out of the MIT community. And I would also ask how many of you are already utilizing other resources available to you on campus. The venture mentoring service, which I've already mentioned, the 100K competition, Delta V, the Engine, the Deshpande Center, iCore, et cetera, right? Without the benefit of seeing all your hands to give us a sense of that, please forgive us as we are going to just kind of launch in. But as you post your comments and questions, if you could let us know a little bit about the perspective you're bringing to that question, that'll also help us to answer them well. Okay. We have fantastic panel this evening. All three of our panelists are knowledgeable, experienced, insightful, and extremely generous to share their time and attention and perspectives this evening. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce yourself by telling us who you are and what perspective you bring to this subject. So, what kinds of capital you work with, what kinds of companies at what stages you work with, what sectoral or other perspectives you bring to bear. And so, Tetyana, since you're already primary on my screen, let's start with you.
Thank you, Julianne. Thank you, Joe and the team for inviting me tonight. I'm very excited to be with you and share my experience with you. So today I am a general partner with the LearnLaunch Fund Plus Accelerator. This is the new name we have. Some of you may know us under LearnLaunch Accelerator name. The way we were founded back in 2013. We are one of the oldest accelerators here in the United States, specialized in education technology. We've made 71 investments in this sector very broadly. So we basically have a 360-degree angle on education, from early childhood to workforce upskilling and reskilling. So agnostic in terms of education, but specialized on education. And the stage of the companies we typically are looking at is pre-seed. And the way we define pre-seed is really having product market fit and a little bit of commercial traction to be able to determine whether assumptions could be true and how we can help. Our approach to investment is very hands-on. In addition to investing in companies, we also provide a lot of support services as they go through our program. And this is what makes the big difference, because the investment amounts are relatively small. And so I can bring the perspective of how an accelerator works and what kind of work we are doing with the companies. And in my past life, I've worked with a group of funds and one of the Europe's largest angel networks called B2B Partners. So I know a little bit about angel syndication and how angels are thinking about deals in a little bit later stage than what I'm currently doing.
Awesome, thank you. Carrie, would you please tell us about who you are and what perspective you bring to this conversation?
All right, thank you, Julianne, and thank you, Joe, for having me. And I wear a bunch of hats, and so I'm bringing some slightly different perspectives, and I'll correct Joe on one thing. I don't know if I'm highly paid. I'm okay, but I'm not a partner at a VC firm, so I want to get that straight. But I'm getting there. We're actually looking at launching a fund shortly, really targeted at people of color in the climate tech space. And that's good, going back to my background. But let me just answer Julianne's question now. But I work with startups all the time. So I'm a mentor with the Venture Mentoring Service. I've been doing that for probably about a dozen years now, maybe more, sort of 2009, I think is when I started doing that work. I am a core instructor for the National Science Foundation's Innovation Core program. So I work with a number of students like yourselves, and so I get to see a lot of startups. I also started a nonprofit Accelerator, really as a pro bono arm of my consulting practice. And we work with the Boston Consulting Group, really focused on founders of color or founders serving underserved communities. So we've gotten to work with close to 90 companies over the last 6 years doing that work as well. And lastly, like I said, I run an organization called Brown in the Green Space, and we're actually about to launch 2 accelerators there. One with Greentown Labs around, like I said, focusing on founders of color and women in the clean tech space, and also a contractor accelerator that's really looking at small businesses. So I think I bring the perspective of someone doing technical assistance and hearing from all of these startup and small business founders and just seeing how they're thinking about that capital piece. And the other pieces that I bring is I sit on the advisory councils for a few investments groups. And so one is the Lab Fund out of MIT Sloan. And so they're looking at investing in founders of color who are alums or students at MIT. SI or Sloan Impact Group, which is looking at social impact sort of out of the Water Prize and 100K and all of those. So I'm an advisor to that group. And lastly, in Boston, there was a group called the Boston Ujima Project, which is really grassroots investing in more small businesses than startups. And so I'm on the investment committee for that organization. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing. So I've seen a little bit of everything, and from stage, it's like super early, sort of mom and pop, to we just had a company in our last cohort to close a Series C round. So I would say from sort of MVP or not even there to sort of Series C is where I play.
And Carrie, for the record, the highly paid amount that Julianne is getting is 0.
Oh, okay, you're talking about for this. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So she can divide that up among the panel however she sees fit.
I'm happy to share it equally.
Well, I'm rich. Well, that's great.
Oh, thank you, Carrie. Noramay, last and certainly not least, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. So excited to chat with you all. I'm also affiliated with MIT, class of 2003 in course 2. I spent about a decade in the aerospace industry before getting into venture capital in 2015. And then I'm also an LGO grad, class of 2011. I'll actually be back on campus February 7th. I'm teaching a seminar for the LGO students. So excited to be back on campus. I got into venture in 2015, really pursuing this, interesting intersection of innovation, equity, and impact, which had really followed the work I was doing in the corporate sector and inspired me to launch a nonprofit organization. And since pivoting into venture, it's been really hard to think about anything else and any greater way to have as much impact in the future products, services, and the wealth generation capability of venture capital. So it is a really exciting space. I co-founded a firm in 2015 here in Los Angeles, where I'm based, that was mostly investing in early stage hardware. So deep tech, IoT, a lot of the areas in which I see interest from this group. We made 22 investments there, all pre-seed and seed. And since then, I've joined a few other organizations, Portfolio's Rising America Fund, investing with the diversity thesis, sector and stage agnostic. We've made investments from pre-seed through Series F, F as in Frank, which is really interesting and wild. And then in 2020, I co-founded a new firm with a Sloan, a friend of mine, investing at the intersection of food, culture, and technology. And we've made 6 investments to date. We're focused on food and ag tech across the supply chain and CPG brands that have an element of culture.
Thank you. So those of you who are with us this evening, and those of you who are viewing asynchronously, I think you have a sense that these are some very accomplished people who are sharing their perspectives with you. So that established, I'm assuming that if you haven't already looked at the materials that Joe shared through the website, the course description, that you will do so. And so you either already are aware or will shortly be aware that there are many, many forms of capital available to growing companies. And as you've already heard from the 3 panelists, there are lots of kinds of growing companies, not only different sectors and different capital needs because of the sectors, but also different shapes of companies as well. And so if you think about bootstrapping and friends and family and customer financing and grants, and increasingly with the number of competitions, prize money and angels and venture capital and bank finance, debt, credit of one kind or another, among others. There's a really wide range of capital varieties out there that are available and that are appropriate for various stages and for various uses. Each of them has their own purpose and their own scale. So I'd like to ask each of you panelists to share what do you find to be the most common misconception or the most common lack of knowledge that founders you work with struggle with when they're thinking about fundraising. Let's just see if we can dispel a couple of myths or a couple of fill a couple of gaps in awareness right out of the gate. Carrie, I saw you nodding.
I will defer to Noramay, and
yeah. One of the something we're hearing a lot through supply chain capital outreach is founders who think that taking outside capital is going to poison their culture and being being a little extreme, right? Poison the culture, take over decision making, and change the ultimate course of a company. So there is hesitation in thinking about venture because it is perceived to be a way that you give up all sense of identity of a company. And so what is interesting to me about this particular fear is that it really creates and carves an opportunity for some of the emerging venture capital investors, like most of us on this panel, who are bringing new perspectives and lived experience to this industry, right? Who want to work in a very specific way, leading up to the investment and then in post-investment support. So I think this is actually a myth that plays well into the rationale and the business case for the need for diverse voices on the check writing side of the table.
Thank you.
And mine was going to be sort of in that similar vein that Noramay just brought up. Is I think people having that idea that even as Noramay was talking, that you're giving away, something that not having the right perspective on what funding is, and this is probably more equity and more VC, and it probably is a myth, but sort of they say where there's smoke, there's fire, and what they've heard, and people have gotten burned because when you take equity, you take equity to grow. And there are people who want you to grow really fast. And if you don't grow faster than they want, there are stories of, this was your baby and you just got kicked out because the board did it. But I think that, to Noramay's point, I think there are people who want to really support you, even on the equity side. And you should think of it as, no, these people are investing in you, and you're actually giving them an opportunity to really hitch their wagon to your storm, and to be a part of that. And so a lot of it is trying to shift mindsets to how people understand. And then it's also very different if you talk about debt, versus that. So it really depends on where the money is coming from. And even the equity, is an angel or is it a VC? Is it private equity? Is it PE? Like what is it? That makes a very big difference. And so really understanding, the relationships, like any other relationship you have with family or friends or loved ones. You need to communicate. You need to have some trust. You need to understand what's going on. But there is this piece of, well, you're giving something away. You shouldn't think of it that way if you enter into it.
So Tetyana, before you weigh in, I want to make it clear to everybody that we'll take a step back and talk about what the expectations are of equity investors and what yours as founder ought to be of them. So I just want to put a pin there, and then Tetyana, what's the biggest myth or gap that you encounter founders struggling with when it comes to finance?
So I would address more of it as a gap, and it's really aligned, even though it may sound a little bit exactly like contrary to what Noramay started, but it actually perfectly is aligned with it. Is that what I most commonly see is that a lot of founders think that venture capital is the only option for them, or that this is the best fit for them, without really analyzing this market, understanding what this market is actually looking for. And it's not even about like how to sell, but actually what is exactly the product that this market is looking for. And is my business a good fit for this market, right? Because there are only very few businesses with very specific parameters that are a good fit for this market. So what we often see is that, and even this is amongst the applicants pool of companies that are applying to the accelerator, we see a lot of great companies, and we tell them that this is a great business and you should keep doing that, but this is not the right source of funding for you. So there are different things that would be a much better fit for what you are and where you are today. So this is from my perspective, this is one of the biggest gaps, is basically the knowledge gap and the understanding of how do I fit to this marketplace. And the marketplace, by the way, today is wonderful. If you would look even 10 years ago, a decade ago, there's so many more platforms and instruments that didn't even exist, that are investing, in billions into companies. And so it's about getting to know this market and understanding where are you the fit, what of the capital markets you're the best fit to.
Yeah, so to your point, 10 years ago, we didn't have platforms for equity crowdfunding. We didn't even have platforms for pre-selling like Kickstarter, where you can generate revenues for a product you don't even have yet, which is, by the way, fantastic. And I will also say, I think that what you have heard from all three panelists is a both and story, right? Like the merits of any particular form of capital are entirely dependent on where you are in the stage of development of your enterprise and what sector you are in and what your growth plans and trajectory look like. So let's rewind back to that pin that we dropped, and let's talk about, how do you decide if venture capital is for you at the angel stage or at the professional VC stage? Noramay, since you started that off, why don't you explain to the attendees how equity investors think and what they're looking for, and how founders should choose an equity investor if there's a match in the purpose of that capital.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So we'll start with early stage, an early stage venture capital, which is a stage in which, as an investor, with my investor hat on, you're looking to join the journey of a fast growing company that has the potential to really scale. So the business case here is I can provide capital that this company is lacking or needing in exchange for equity in the company. So this is the Shark Tank example, right? I'll give you X amount of money in exchange for X percentage of my business. And then you support the company. Maybe the model is that you are a very hands-on investor. You don't have to be. There are certainly investors that are less involved post-investment, but the point is you have value to add, and it can be capital or capital plus. And the outcome here is that as an investor, I'm taking this bet early. There's a lot of risk associated with the company's goals, plans, market opportunity, but I'm betting on the fact that they're going to figure out growth and scale. And when this company exits, either through acquisition or IPO, that multiple on the capital that I initially invested is going to be significant for my fund. In many cases, you're looking for that significance in multiple to return enough capital to substantiate the entire fund. So if this is a $10 million fund, you're looking for the multiple on your $100,000 check, for example, to return your $10 million fund. On the founder side, you're looking for an investor that believes in the opportunity your business presents, that is going to support you in the ways that you'd like to be supported. And again, different schools of thought here in terms of whether you want a hands-on investor or don't, but most early stage founders do want some level of support and access to networks and introductions as part of the capital. It is becoming increasingly important and valuable for founders to find values fit as well. Mm-hmm. So they want to pick investors who share their view of the world, who will operate with the same sort of operational kindness or dignity that they're interested in, and will support them as they need to grow. So I'll start there, Julianne, and then we can allow the other panelists to continue to build.
Yeah, thank you. So a really key thing for you to know as a founder, if you are seeking an equity investment, whether that's angel or venture, as Noramay was just describing, is that their expectation in making that investment is that there will be a sale of the company at some point, that the company will either be acquired by another company, a merger and acquisition transaction, or the company will have an IPO or a DPO or whatever. And so you need to go into that relationship with that understanding that is the expectation, and that's the investor has a fund. Sorry, somebody asked us a DPO. That's a direct public offering. Thank you for flagging for us. So you are expecting, under the equity investment terms, that you are going to work with your investors to grow the value of the company so that you can have a high value sale that returns their fund, and ideally also returns have very handsome windfall to you as the founder. So what if you are not growing a super fast growing company, or if you don't want to sell in 3 to 8 years time? what other options, Tetyana, you already mentioned that you spend a lot of time talking to founders with really great companies about the other kinds of capital they should be pursuing.
Yeah, so I maybe just to add 1 cent to what you've been saying, and Noramay started talking about, is that I think that it's really important to sort of like understand how an investor is thinking, and also to be ready to upgrade your understanding of scale with their understanding of scale, because these multiples that we were mentioning here, they often imply that we are talking about an exit of, you know, several $100 million. So, and this should be reflected in your business plan. And oftentimes, it also implies that you should be open and willing and hungry to raise much more capital than just this investment that you're asking from this particular investor. So there are a lot of strings attached to that. And coming back to your question, Julianne, I think that, I mean, we likely often see the models that I was referring to, that we like, but have to decline often when they come to an accelerator, are models that are, for instance, heavily service-focused models, right? That have where the technology component is not as prominent, and then also we don't see how it can become more prominent and also lead to the scale that we were talking about. And oftentimes, these type of businesses, they are a good fit for debt financing, and especially if, and it's also like much cheaper. You know, disregarding, it's also a much cheaper way to fund your business. And also on the debt financing landscape, there are different modalities or different type of things that you can consider, from straight bank loans, depending again on what stage your business is in and whether you would meet their risk profile, to other lending platforms out there, to also specialized investors that are providing venture-like debt that that behaves both as debt and as loan, and also can have some equity components, but they are not as dominant and not as, let's say, painful to the recipient. So it's in a nutshell, if I would put a span, these are the things that I would describe would be a better fit for other types of businesses.
Thank you. And Carrie, I know that you do a lot of work with companies of all kinds, some technology forward, others less so, and that you're involved in several competition and grant organizations as well. Help us to understand what role grant capital specifically plays in a wide variety of businesses early on, and how founders should think about grants potentially as part of their funding portfolio.
Yeah, happy to do that. And before I do that, maybe following up on sort of what Noramay and Tetyana said, I was following the chat too, I saw things about, purchase order financing, DPOs, direct public offerings, so where you're going out to the community and they can get a little bit, and it almost feels a little bit more like an angel-esque thing where they're not really, wanting to get ridiculous returns. They're just wanting to support the growth of your business, and they can say that they, are owners. You think of, we just watched, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you think about it, Aaron Rodgers and the Packers go down. But if you think of Lambeau Stadium, Lambeau is owned by, the people in the area. It's owned by the people up in Wisconsin, and so you can think about all those different ways to do that. And there's revenue-based financing where it's almost more loan like. And so as I think about the Boston New Jima project that we work on, that's really more loan, money that's going out. But to your question, Julianne, if you don't have to take money, don't take it. And if somebody's going to give you free money, take free money. And so why wouldn't you take a grant? Why wouldn't you take SBIR or STTR or government funding? And we talk about that as dilutive versus non-dilutive. And so the non-dilutive is the grants, and whether from a foundation or government, and a lot of, especially tech companies, they do that. That's what NSF is for, the National Science Foundation and others. And so do that until you need to go and take equity. And so you need to think about that timing. Competitions, you can burn out from pitching too much. And so pick the right ones, but it's also not just about the dollars. Sometimes it's about the connections and people seeing you, and you understanding, and you might get other things. There's in-kind support. There are people that you get to know. If I think of, and Tetyana, I know Gene Hammond really well over at LearnLaunch. You're in this network, in this ecosystem of people. If you're on a cohort, you meet other people. You get to learn from other founders. And so anything that you can get, take it. And so grant funding has, been great for a lot of founders to be able to figure out, can they get to product market fit? Is there an MVP, that makes sense? And then once you get that and get some traction and moving, that's probably the only time you're going to get, VC funding to come in anyway. They want to know that you have traction, you got a solid team, that you really have a product, and to Tetyana's point, typically a product, not a service, because services don't scale. And that's unfortunate in the sense of we need to be putting a lot more people to work. And unfortunately, a lot of the VC funding is going, and I'm an MIT guy a couple times over, to tech and, SaaS this or, these things, because they're scalable. You can just put a small team of, 5, 10, 15, 20, and you can just grow it out. And so typically they're looking for that. But we do need funding for places where, hey, we need to create, hundreds and thousands of jobs. That's probably going to be different funding.
Yeah, go ahead, Tetyana, please.
I just add one paragraph to this, because we haven't mentioned this, but there are also players out there that provide so-called revenue-based or royalty-based funding as a variety. So this is, for instance, also a very good fit for the services focused businesses, is basically because you will be paying off that of what you will be making, and there are different ways how to structure it. And we've been a lot in discussions with other impact investors and trying to think creatively how to come up even with some new instruments. And we've seen some new instruments that would be like a combination of royalty-based and a little bit of equity for companies that are not necessarily super hyper growth, but are still exitable businesses, still interesting businesses. So there is some motion and development and some new things coming up to the market, though really extremely slow. And I just will, plus on grant funding, really important. With our companies, we see that a lot of them raise multiples. We have certain portfolio companies that raised 2-3 million in grant funding, and this is amazing. Investors love these type of businesses because this is basically technology developed for free, right? And both to the team as well as to the people that invest afterwards. So this makes you definitely more attractive and more valuable to other funders that you will be talking to.
Thank you. So Carrie, you touched on something that I know is dear to Joe's heart, and which I always like to encourage founders to access whenever they can, and that is customer-based financing and in-kind support. So, let's say that you have an early prototype and you have some customers interested. How can you make use of that customer interest to fully develop that product and get it out to market before you are really ready to go to investors or even banks?
Yeah, once again, it's really about relationships, and so leverage that, and especially some of these larger customers, and you're seeing a lot more of this, and you're seeing these in-house sort of VC firms because I think that's the way a lot of them see is they can find something you're doing, you get something started up, and then they can acquire you. That's an exit. To have sort of a merger or an acquisition. And so oftentimes they're pilots. You can get paid pilots that you'll work with, and it's good. They've got the networks. They know the people. They've got the channels. They've got the customers. You're coming with the know-how and the ingenuity and the chutzpah or whatever, and it can be a great partnership, and it could be you could become an acquisition target down the road. And so if you can do that, definitely do it. If you can find someone you're really aligned with, and think about that when you're mapping. Not everybody's a competitor. You might think that they're a competitor, but they might be a partner or an someone who could acquire you. So just think about that as you're sort of mapping out where you're headed.
Yeah, so first of all, just getting paid to finish that development work is fantastic, right? Because that brings in revenue as opposed to costing you money. Noramay, what are some other ways that people acquire or access in-kind support that offsets their need for capital?
I think early stage programs around the country that are sort of intersectional or affinity based, right? Either it is a short boot camp that is all about health tech or deep tech or IoT. Maybe it's an abridged TechStars program, not the kind that takes a lot of equity, but maybe a short spurt of a program. I think those are great places to find mentors that may provide short-term in-kind support, but could lead to much greater value, either themselves or through their network. So that's a great way that I've seen founders take advantage of this. And I'll share one quick story from my Mila portfolio. Back in early 2015, we invested in a health wearable company that at the time was thinking about using the wearable, which they talked about sensing your emotions, using it for your own mental health. And they ended up meeting a biotech firm who was interested in using the hardware device to test, possibly diagnose, and treat subset of the population. And so they actually entered into a development contract that enabled them to be paid for developing very specific software to enable these algorithms. So it was a pivot that they weren't quite looking for. They were targeting a very different different customer sector, but based on that interest and that developmental contract that they thought, if this goes somewhere, this could be exciting too. But if it doesn't go anywhere, this will fund the development on the other side. And so it was a very open-ended contract, and it actually wound up being a very new and exciting direction for the company as a whole. So they essentially had R&D funded that enabled them to find an even better customer segment they were not previously aware of.
That's a fantastic example. Thank you for that. For those of you who are part of the MIT community, there's a whole host of freely accessible services and programs that really significantly offset your costs. If you are student, faculty, staff, alumni of MIT, for example, you can access the venture mentoring service, which gets you essentially a high-powered board of advisors for free. You can access legal office hours, which again gets you really, really accomplished legal counsel for small small bites, let's say, of legal guidance, but again, for free. Members of as Noramay said, of more affinity-based groups can find similar kinds of services that offset your need for capital, right? And that can help you find the right capital connections. So that might be, for example, here in Boston, there's a group called Branch Foods. That's a network of food-related startups. And as Carrie said, you draw on not only the experts in that network, but peers as well. One of the things that I tell founders all the time is that actually your peers are your very best intelligence network. So, who are the founders doing similar things to what you are doing, who are maybe anywhere between 6 months and 3 years ahead of you? They're your peers. They can tell you what has been helpful to them and what they have struggled with. They can tell you what resources were readily available, which ones were maybe not worth the trouble, etc. So absolutely, even if you feel like you are at a loss to have a network of bankers or investors, you nevertheless have a network of peers, fellow founders, sororal founders. And not everyone will be helpful, but if you call them up and ask them to, give you 15 minutes of advice, many of them will. And not only that, but then somebody calls you in a year or 2 years or 5 and asks you for advice, you'll give it. That's how it works. So you really do want to take advantage of that intelligence network. We've gone around a few different kinds of capital in a very general way. I'd really like, in the spirit of the example Noramay shared, I'd really like to talk about a couple of examples you can point to from your own experience of founders who have been particularly effective in figuring out the right kind of capital for their enterprise, whether they did that themselves or whether they did that as a result of getting particularly good outside advice. What have you seen to be a particularly effective process for figuring out what kind of capital should I get for my enterprise, and how do I find my way to the right sources of that capital?
Yeah, I'll give a couple examples and maybe give some, non-tech examples, and maybe follow up on a couple things that Noramay and Tetyana shared. And so if you talk like revenue-based financing, I think of here in Boston, a group like Boston Impact Initiative. They're doing some of that with some of the things that they're doing. And also, and I'll give a plug to one of my nonprofits, the Majira project. We do it in partnership with the Boston Consulting Group. It's no fee, no equity, and in a sense, you're getting like maybe a $250,000 consulting engagement for free. So if you can do that, do it. And so take advantage of whatever you can do. It's affinity based, sort of like Noramay said, is we're focused on founders of color, but that's there. One example, and this may answer a little bit of going back to the DPO piece, like 2 of the founders or companies that went through our program actually did do DPOs because they weren't going to be like hockey stick growth and go way off. So they matched the right funding. So organization called Cero, and so they're doing composting. So if Roxbury, Dorchester, black men, Latinas, they needed to buy a truck and things so they could do that. And so they did a direct public offering, and they're a co-op. And so, VCs might not touch co-ops because they're worker on. So they were restricted. They couldn't really go after that. And a similar company, Democracy Brewing, they've got a microbrewery downtown Crossing. They did a direct public offering as well. And so those are just a couple of examples of you need to match sort of your growth. So if you have, geometric or linear growth versus, hockey stick or exponential growth, you need to be looking at different funders to do that.
Go ahead, Tetyana.
And if I come back to your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you asked, like, what's the process? What could be the process for figuring out what's the best thing for you? I think that the best advice here is go out and talk to your peers and also other participants in the market. And so really benefit fully from the social, immerse yourself into social capital, into networks that are startup networks that are out there, and really get the wisdom out there. Because you don't have to reinvent the wheel, because there are companies very similar to yours that have done that. So go find them and talk to them and ask them why, and then figure out whether it's a good pathway for you or not. So it's really always a learning process. And as an example, and again, if you ask for an advice, so many doors will be open to you. There's so many, a lot of investors will talk to you, a lot of angels will talk to you, a lot of mentors will talk to you. So it's going out and just, doing your research to figure out what's the best fit for you, because you, at the end of the day, also have to believe that this is the right thing, right? As an example from our portfolio, I really like, we have a company called Unruly Studios. And she really founded the company. It's a STEM product for K-12 that has a physical component, so floor tiles that are programmable, and that is it's a STEM and engineering product basically for kids at school. And her big vision was that even a gym teacher will be able to teach kids how to program. So when she started 4 years ago, it really sounded a little crazy. And she started really on Kickstarter, and her very, very first couple of dollars that she raised, because it was a physical product, because it was a product that a consumer also could validate, she went to Kickstarter and raised whatever, the first $30,000 or $40,000 on Kickstarters. Then it was a whole exploration of the angel world, step by step, very small tickets, different types of angel groups, because she's a female founder. She leveraged a lot organizations that were supporting female founders and diverse entrepreneurs and impact-oriented ventures. So basically did the whole, scrape that area as much as possible. And today, luckily, this is a stable company that can go and talk to any basically venture fund in edtech space with a very solid story. The way was very, very hard, and it was a way of really learning by doing and exploring and flipping every opportunity that was coming along her way. So this is just the best advice is to go and I mean, I know it sounds maybe a little simple, but you will have to be figuring out it yourself through experience that you will be gathering.
I'll second that, just to say again, you can learn an enormous amount just by looking at companies you like, founders you respect and admire, particularly again, if they're doing something similar to you, just by following what they've done and reaching out to them to ask them for their advice. So Samit, I promised we would get to you, and it's now time for the Q&A. So you get to go first.
First of all, thank you so much for everyone for being here and for the love of your presentation. I had a quick question. A while ago, you guys mentioned the MIT Venture Mentoring Service, and you also kind of mentioned legal office hours. Is that only for folks who have kind of been accepted to the venture mentoring service? Because in my field, like in a lot of fields, I feel like the patent landscape is quite tricky and it's like a minefield. And like I'm thinking about starting a particular venture, but it's kind of hard for me to make heads or tails too much about like cross licensing, and if my venture it would be too hard to license other things and so on and so forth. I was wondering, for those sort of pre-venture cases, what are the best resources for legal advice or legal perspective?
So just to make sure I understand, you are a member of the MIT community?
Yeah, I'm a grad student.
Okay. You're at where?
A grad student at MIT.
Grad student, perfect. So The venture mentoring service is open to anyone in the community, even if you just have a concept. So there's not like a qualifying set of criteria. It really is open to all members of the community who want to have access to advice and guidance for their entrepreneurial endeavor. And so literally, we have people who come through VMS who say, I'm contemplating starting something in this area, or I've done some research at MIT, or in some cases, I've done some side research that's unrelated to MIT, and I'm interested in figuring out how to go to market. Thank you, Joe. And so there are lots of services offered by VMS through that program, the legal office hours included. There are also other organizations on campus that offer other services as well for free to the participants in those programs. And they have different, in some cases, sectoral or stage or other focus. So VMS is the most generalist, but I would encourage you, without knowing what your concept is or the sector, I would encourage you to look around at the other organizations, not just on campus, but around Boston as well. And to see who offers the advice and support and services that are most valuable to you. And by the way, these are not exclusive relationships, right? So you can participate in VMS and also, let's say, the Deshpande Center, and also, let's say, the Martin Trust Center, and also, say, I-Corps program, and right? And then there are also programs as well, again, that are not affiliated with MIT, and again, they are also not exclusive, right? So you really should access, as you've heard from the other panelists, all of the resources that are available to you, particularly the ones that are available to you for free, right? Because those enable you to really make the most progress that you possibly can before you really have to start thinking about how are you going to find actual capital.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. This is so helpful.
Absolutely. I'm glad to hear it. Who else? Oh, thank you for that link, Joe. So Joe just posted a link to MIT BU Law Clinic as well. Other questions from the attendees and participants? You're welcome to put them in the chat or raise a hand. What can we answer for you?
And while we're waiting for someone to come in, I'll sort of echo what Julianne just said, especially for those in the MIT community. I mean, there's an embarrassment of riches in terms of all the opportunities. Like and especially, and if you're in Sloan, it's even added, so there's, all the competitions, 100K and, all the water prize and all these different prizes. And there's D Lab and S Lab and start this and stop that and
Delta V.
Yeah, Delta. So there's just so many things. And so you should, during your stay, whether undergrad or grad, you should do at least one of those things. Even if you're not even thinking about it, go support somebody support somebody who is starting something up. Even if you go off and take a job at Amazon or Google or something, this is a great opportunity to just see. I wish I would have done that. As an undergrad in environmental engineering, I was a engineering snob. I was like, I didn't even know that that other side of campus existed. I didn't know. I was like, business? I was like, why would I come to MIT to study business? Like, in my mind, it didn't make any sense. And so I think there is a piece of, get involved, try something. You've got an opportunity to do it in one of the greatest ecosystems to do it. So don't just sit and watch. Jump in and do something.
Yeah. Stephanie asked in the chat, can non-MIT students work along with MIT students? Absolutely. We work with lots of teams that include people who are members of the MIT community and others. You're all enjoying the musical interlude courtesy of my husband. So I don't usually get to like riff to a beat. The requirement for VMS specifically is that the connection is led by an MIT person, but very often we have teams comprising students from other institutions as well as people who are not academically affiliated at all. I hope that answered your question, Stephanie. And by the way, there are similar programs at lots of other institutions. Some of them are sister entities or daughter entities to VMS, where the VMS organization has partnered with another university or other institution to help them stand up their own program, and others are completely unrelated. So, you know, if you are affiliated with another university, I really encourage you to seek out the tech transfer office or commercialization office or whatever office is available to you, and ask them what resources are available to you on campus or through the campus network. Also, anyone here in Massachusetts should know that we have quasi-governmental entities like the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, for example, that also provides grant and investment capital both to promising companies that meet their criteria. And there are several other entities like that have specific mandates. And again, those exist in other states as well.
Thank you so much.
And this is for Stephanie too. I saw it. Well, there may be another Stephanie. I think it was you. There was a question about co-opetition in the chat. So I was just going to give an example of co-opetition. So I worked at Texas Instruments in the semiconductor industry, sort of after grad school. And so, for example, there was, Semicon is getting all of the semiconductor manufacturers together. And so they were coming together, the Texas Instruments, the Intels, the Hewlett Packards, the HPs, and they would work on things that weren't necessarily like safety. We can all work on safety together because that shouldn't be the differentiator. And so that might be, versus competition, sort of co-opetition, and you sort of work together on some things.
Thank you so much.
Anybody else? We have a few minutes left for any other questions.
Julianne, if there aren't any questions, I'd love to give a quick, another quick story.
Yeah, please. We love stories.
A founder who sort of found his way at Supply Chain Capital. Our latest investment is in a food media company called Whetstone Media. The company was actually founded in 2015, and the CEO, Stephen Satterfield, went through culinary school and really has a passion for telling the stories of the people and ecosystems behind the food we consume. So he started in 2017 with what was a print magazine. Now you can imagine how difficult it is to sustain a print magazine. And so he then started a creative agency to really keep the print magazine going. And then had the opportunity to launch a podcast series with iHeartRadio. Netflix picked up a show that Stephen Satterfield hosted called High on the Hog. And if you haven't seen the series, it is beautifully done. And then he had this idea for a multi-platform media company that is really publishing, podcasting, e-commerce, and a creative studio. And he started pitching it to other media companies. And he found that it was actually really hard for other media companies to think about investing in him because they know how hard it is to build up a large media company. So he started a crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo in 2021 and raised about a little over $100,000. And so he started the podcast with that capital, and the capital he made off the Netflix show. And then it started raising from angel investors. So he thought, let me pursue people who are deeply committed to storytelling and global storytelling. So Guy Raz from NPR's How I Built This became an advisor and an angel investor. He had a few angel investors, one in India, one in the US. And then we met him back in March, almost a year ago, and started building a relationship and learning more about the company. And long story short, he's about to close on his formal pre-seed round with us as the lead investor. But it was really a long journey, right? From publishing a magazine to running a creative agency, the crowdfunding campaign, the failed media company investments, to small angel dollars, to really finding affinity with the right type of investor who understood the opportunity. So I think that's a creative story to show you all the different layers he really had to explore to get to where he is now.
And that's a lot of ground to cover in 4.5 years. So, obviously he was really diligent in continuing to keep exploring, which is absolutely, I will say, the theme of entrepreneurship is just absolute dogged persistence in exploring constantly. So Amy asked, how do you find impact investors, in her case, who know specifically how to navigate through telehealth reimbursement? I'll give a general answer and then toss it out to the three of you for something more specific, if you can offer it. Again, as we've been saying, I really encourage you to look at companies in telehealth that have reimbursement-based models and look at, how have they gotten to where they are? Who backed them, right? Or if they don't have outside investors, how did they capitalize their growth to this point? And again, ask them. But also, it's there's a lot of affinity groups that have grown up just in the last couple of years for, as Noramay alluded, investors who are focused on either particular problems or particular technology verticals or particular segments or particular kinds of solutions. And so I would really encourage you to search out those communities as resources to provide the kind of more specific information you're looking for. But who would add to that?
I'm happy to add to it. So, this going back to sort of my I-core piece is like, what's the problem? So if you think of telehealth, who needs that solution? And just think about that. It's really sort of going back to what Julianne said. But for example, if I were thinking, and one of my friends she's at Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Blue Cross Blue Shield in Massachusetts, they actually have a investment, vehicle called Zaffer Ventures. You know what? They probably understand this. They understand. They're in insurance. They're thinking about telehealth. They probably know people. So think about that, and you can just go look. There are VC groups in health that's what they specialize in. Noramay specializes in food. There are people who specialize in health. You go find those folk, and it may be a little bit more difficult. Some of them aren't just you show up and you just walk in, but I think really working that customer angle works well, and also you can get into it via some of these accelerators or whatnot. They're going to have the connection, so you get into a healthcare accelerator or a program. They're going to have those connections too, and they'll do that piece. So to sort of Noramay's point on that last one, that was like a 4.5 year story. Man, this stuff takes a lot of time. It's 6 years or 7 years sometimes, or 10 years. A lot of these things, people aren't overnight successes. They've been doing this work They know their customers. They know the problems. You really should know this stuff better than anybody else. And oftentimes you can learn really quickly. It might not take years. It just takes you going out and having those conversations with people to get to the solution.
Sorry, I just put in the chat. There are groups like Mass Medical Angels, for example, where, as Carrie said, you can find a lot of information just by looking at what they're investing in and connecting with people there who are willing to share their expertise. I see a hand up, Ravi. We are just at time, but if it's a quick one, we'll happily take it for you.
How do I find among hundreds and thousands of investors someone who actually will fit? How do I choose, filter those people, all the investors, and focus only on 10 or 15 of them, so that I don't waste on too many talking to the hundreds of investors? How do I narrow down my investment group?
Yeah, so really, really quickly, again, I think as we've been discussing, you want to look for investors who have a track record of investing in companies like the one you aim to build. I think you want to talk to other founders who are building similar kinds of companies, find out what sources of capital they have found helpful and beneficial. And I think you also want to look at industry or technology or sector communities to see who's active in those communities and seek out their advice. I'm actually
in the cloud computing, high-tech data center. There are, as I mentioned, hundreds of them who are willing to do those kind of things, invest in my kind of companies. They have invested, and I look at all the companies, smaller companies, which are startup companies, who are the investors, and even look at each one of those companies, but it's a never-ending list.
Well, the good news is that you have lots of resources to draw on. Not everybody has that particular challenge. However, I think you start where you have a connection in front of you, whether that's an organization you already belong to or one where you already have some other connections, and start asking the questions. As Noramay said, you may not find that you've come to an answer immediately or in a straight line. It may take you a couple of years, or, in the case of the story she shared, 4 or 5 years to find your way. And there simply is not a kind of easy button for this. There's no fairy godmother, I wish there were, to whack each of us on the head and sort of make the magical solution appear. But again, if you start with the resources that are close at hand and ask questions about where you should be focusing, I think you will find that people are generally willing to share their good advice.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Good luck.
Thank you.
And with that, I will thank our fantastic panelists, Noramay, Carrie, and Tetyana. Thank you all very, very much for sharing your time and perspective this evening. You are all fabulous. And thank you all participating in the class for your attention and your questions. And I wish all of you every possible success.
Thank you, Julianne. And again, a great panel. So many things to cover in such a small amount of time. Are you willing to stay around during the breakout rooms for additional questions? I understand you did not commit to that, but we can make that available. Then secondly, I just put on the Nuts and Bolts website under this session an overview deck around the things we had talked about earlier about where to people get money, et cetera, just as background. So with that, I think we can move to breakout rooms with the TAs.
I can stay in just another few minutes. I have
Okay.
I have a commitment at 7:30.
Okay, that's fine. You can always log off. So
And
who's
Noramay
running?
said no, she needs to go.
Okay.
Thank you, Noramay.
All right. So it's
Bye, everyone.
okay. It sounds like it's breakout rooms tonight. Thank you all very much, and we will we'll put the check in the mail. Okay, great. So the breakout rooms, I think, are getting. I'm trying to figure out where they are here. Are they open?
Yeah, they were just opened. Same
Okay,
as
excellent.
Yeah.
And we'll be back at about 7:35, 7:40, something like that.
Okay.
Excellent. Julianne, I realize we don't have a sort of a direct, a lot of the resources that you would look at, PitchBook and other kinds of things for traditional venture, it's such an emerging area that you're in, that I imagine that I'm not aware of any sort of central resource. I mean, obviously Google searches, searches and stuff will.
You mean for investors specifically looking for BIPOC and female founders?
Yeah, things like that.
So yeah, there is not a kind of comprehensive directory. What Carrie's doing with Browning the Green Space is really fantastic. We have a bunch of resources on our website. It's absolutely not comprehensive. I've talked with several people who have attempted to put together reasonably comprehensive lists. In some cases of investors who are specifically focused on women, or in other cases, investors who are focused on Black and Brown founders, or investors who are specifically focused on Latinx founders, or investors who are focused on founders who are otherwise overlooked by the venture community writ large, whether those are veteran founders or LGBTQ founders or founders who are in the Midwest. So I think there are lots of initiatives variously distributed around where people are trying to gather that information, but no, to the best of my knowledge, there is no comprehensive archive.
Well, the internet searching does turn up a lot of things. So if I think back 15 or 20 years, it was very opaque about, who do you go to for money, and you needed to go through gatekeepers and other sorts. So.
And that's still largely true for a lot of the venture firms. For many of the entities like LearnLaunch, where Tetyana is, or like the various things that Kerry's leading, or for us, in all cases, we're much more receptive to people reaching out to us. You were going to say something, Tetyana.
Yeah, I wanted to say in terms of investors, I've noticed, for instance, that Crunchbase has started adding some information about, like, for instance, how many female teams this particular firm supported off total, or how many teams where people of color are founders this firm supported. So based on this, you can actually make certain judgment in terms of how, likely it is that that this could be of what you're looking for. So this is new. So I would say that this is probably like 2 years ago or so they started tracking, and you can also do some other search. So you actually can do like multi-criteria search there. And it's much better than just going and doing Google research, because this is already a distilled database of investors only.
Do you think that with the emerging emphasis on ESG at the corporate level, I know a lot of corporations are trying to figure out what their ESG strategy is and what they are doing. Do you see any of the entrepreneurs you're looking at taking advantage of that, or is that still such a murky area? It's very spot specific.
I would say yes and yes. I mean, there certainly are people who are finding ways to gain access to corporate funding or in-kind support, either one. Morgan Stanley and Microsoft and Google and others have entire programs that are set up incubator or accelerator style. And I will also say that my observation, and this is borne out by, numbers reported by a variety of objective observers, is that over 2020 and 2021, the venture sector had record-breaking boom years. And the relative dollar figures going to BIPOC and female founders, depending on how you count and where you count, either held steady or in some cases actually dropped.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. So we haven't seen a lot of that. We haven't seen a lot of the sort of public declarations yet convert into actual capital flows. And Carrie's nodding, so and I think you've seen very much the same thing. There are several initiatives I've seen people putting forward, mostly public sector facing, like shareholder activist kinds of investors who want to hold public companies accountable for having made those declarations and say, okay, well, you made this declaration, you got a lot of goodwill. In some cases, you got a lot of free exposure. Maybe you even got a share price bump. What have you done?
What have you actually done? Yes.
And there have been several recent initiatives floated specifically to do that. I will say, until or unless there's some combination of an incentive and a consequence, generally speaking, people don't like to change their behavior, right? So it usually takes both.
Okay. Excellent. Good drumming.
He's actually teaching, so that's whatever
okay.
lesson his student is supposed to be working on.
Good.
So I'm going to need to sign off.
Okay.
I hope this was effective for everyone in attendance. Again, Noramay's gone, but thank you very much, Carrie. Thank you very much, Tetyana. And I think the advice we gave was worth every penny you paid for it.
No, it's worth infinite. So if zero is the denominator, but no, it's great. It's very good.
All right. Well,
thank you very much.
Sign off. Good night, everyone. Best of luck again to all the attendees, and I hope you all have a safe and restful evening ahead.
All right. Thank you.
And I apologize. I'm going to follow Julianne. I left my email in the
chat.
Yep. Exactly. Or please feel free also to share with the group other ways. And I would love to, if there are, I've seen that education was a topic of interest for many of you. So I'm open to chatting in person and hearing more about the ventures you're working on. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent.
Thank you. Same for me. And I'm just carrie.bowie@alum.mit.edu. I've got like 4 email addresses, but Julianne or somebody can give me one of mine. So that's fine.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Great. So we'll take a break here as we wait for the breakout rooms and be back in a few minutes. Bye.